The snow fell like frozen tears that December night, when Pastor Samuel Morrison found them huddled against his church door, their bodies pressed together in desperate communion against the bitter wind that cut through the streets of Millbrook like a blade seeking bone. A woman clutching two children, their faces hollow with hunger, carved by desperation into masks of silent pleading, their clothes thin as hope itself and worn to threads that spoke of dreams deferred and dignity slowly stripped away by circumstance beyond their control. Ice crystals had formed in the woman's dark hair, creating a crown of suffering that caught the pale light filtering through the church's ancient stained glass windows. Her breath came in visible puffs, each exhalation a prayer made manifest in the frigid air. "Please," she whispered through chattering teeth, her voice cracking like old parchment touched by flame. "We have nowhere else to go. The shelters turned us away hours ago. We've been walking since sunset, and my children." Her words dissolved into silence more eloquent than any plea, her eyes reflecting the kind of exhaustion that reaches beyond physical tiredness into the realm of spiritual depletion. The children pressed against her sides like wounded birds, seeking shelter from a storm that had already broken their wings. The little girl's eyes, wide with premature understanding of adult failures, tracked Samuel's every movement, while the boy buried his face against his mother's worn coat, his small shoulders shaking with more than cold. Their silence carried the weight of too many disappointments, too many doors closed in their faces, too many promises broken by people who meant well but couldn't deliver hope. What Samuel would discover about this family would challenge everything he believed about faith, mercy, and the true meaning of divine providence, forcing him to confront questions that seminary had never prepared him to answer, and revealing truths about human nature that would shake the very foundations of his calling. Samuel had always been a man of unwavering conviction, his faith as steady as the granite foundation beneath St. Matthew's Church, where he had served for 27 years, shepherding souls through the storms and seasons of life in the small town of Millbrook. His congregation knew him as a man whose sermons could move hearts to tears, and whose personal counsel had guided them through marriages, divorces, births, deaths, and all the messy complications that filled the space between those milestone moments. He was 53 years old with silver threading through his dark hair, a man whose hands bore the calluses of honest work, and whose eyes carried the particular kind of weariness that comes from carrying other people's burdens as if they were his own. He had never married, dedicating his life entirely to his calling, finding his family in the faces that filled his pews each Sunday morning, and his children in every soul that sought guidance in his modest office behind the altar. St. Matthew's stood like a beacon on Elm Street, its white steeple reaching toward heaven, with the confidence of a man who had never truly doubted God's plan, its walls holding within them decades of prayers, confessions, celebrations, and grief. The church had been his life's work, growing from a struggling congregation of 37 members when he arrived fresh from seminary to a thriving community of nearly 200 souls who trusted him with their deepest fears and highest hopes. But that night, as he stared into the desperate eyes of strangers who had appeared like specters from some distant disaster, something shifted in the very foundation of his faith. A tremor so subtle he almost missed it, yet so profound it would change everything that came after. The woman's gaze met his through the falling snow, and in that moment, he saw reflected not just her desperation, but his own fundamental assumptions about how God's love was supposed to work in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to suffering. The woman introduced herself as Elena Vasquez, her voice barely above a whisper, each word carefully chosen as if she were rationing them like precious resources in short supply. Her accent carried traces of Spanish mixed with years of American adaptation, the musical quality of her native tongue softened by exhaustion and hardship. She appeared to be in her early 30s, though suffering had carved lines around her eyes that belonged to someone older, someone who had seen too much of the world's casual cruelty. Her children, Sophia, 8 years old with dark eyes that seemed to hold centuries of inherited wisdom, and Miguel, 6, with his mother's delicate features but his father's stubborn chin, pressed against her sides like frightened birds, seeking shelter from a storm that had been raging far longer than this single night. Sophia wore a thin pink jacket that had once been bright, but now bore the grey patina of too many washings and too many nights spent sleeping in places not meant for dreaming. Miguel clutched a small stuffed dinosaur that had lost most of its color and one eye, but which he held with the fierce devotion that only children can bring to their treasures. Their story tumbled out in broken fragments, pieces of a puzzle that formed a picture Samuel had heard variations of dozens of times in his ministry, but which struck him tonight with particular force. Eviction notice served 3 days ago, when Elena's employer, a wealthy family on the other side of town, had decided to move to Florida without the courtesy of proper notice. No family to call, because pride and geography had created chasms that desperation could not bridge. No money for food, because Eleanor's last paycheck had gone entirely to medical bills from Sophia's emergency room visit, when she broke her wrist falling from playground equipment too old and dangerous for children to use safely. "The shelters are all full," Elena explained, her eyes glistening with unshed tears that she refused to let fall in front of her children, maintaining the fierce dignity of mothers who know that their strength is often all that stands between their children and absolute despair. "I tried everywhere. The Salvation Army, the Methodist Church downtown, even the Catholic shelter on 5th Street. The Social Services Office said there's a waiting list 3 weeks long, and emergency vouchers won't be available until after the new year." She paused, swallowing hard, her throat working against words that tasted of defeat. "I know this is God's house. I thought maybe he would have room for us even if nobody else does. My children haven't eaten since yesterday morning and I—" Her voice broke finally, the careful control she had maintained crumbling like a dam that could no longer hold back the flood. Samuel felt his heart crack open like ice under spring sun, the careful barriers he had built between his professional compassion and personal investment dissolving in the face of such raw need. Without hesitation, without consulting any church policy or considering any potential complications, he ushered them inside, the warmth of the sanctuary embracing them like a mother's arms, welcoming children home after a long and difficult journey. He led them to the small kitchen behind the altar, where he prepared simple sandwiches and hot soup, while the children sat in silence, their eyes following his every movement, with a mixture of hope and wariness that spoke of too many broken promises. As they ate, Samuel learned more about their journey. Elena worked as a housekeeper until her employer moved away without notice, leaving her unemployed and desperate. The children's father had disappeared years ago, leaving behind only questions and the weight of abandonment that pressed down on Elena's shoulders, like stones in a sinking ship. She had fought to keep her family together, taking odd jobs, stretching every dollar until it screamed. But the world had finally caught up with her fierce determination. "Mrs. Vasquez," Samuel said gently, refilling her coffee cup, "you're welcome to stay in the church fellowship hall tonight. We have cots in the storage room and it's warm and safe." He watched relief flood across her face like sunrise after the longest night. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next." But as the family settled into makeshift beds in the fellowship hall, Samuel found himself unable to sleep. He paced his modest parsonage next door, wrestling with thoughts that felt foreign to his usually certain mind. Why had God placed this burden on his doorstep? His church operated on a tight budget. The congregation, while faithful, consisted mostly of elderly members living on fixed incomes and young families struggling to make ends meet themselves. The next morning brought unexpected complications. Mrs. Dorothy Hendricks, the church treasurer and unofficial guardian of congregational opinion, arrived early to find the Vasquez family washing up in the church bathroom. Her reaction was swift and sharp as winter wind. "Pastor Morrison," she said, cornering him in his office with the efficiency of a prosecutor, "we need to discuss this situation immediately. The church board never approved housing vagrants in our sanctuary. What if they steal something? What if other homeless people see this and start camping on our property?" Samuel felt heat rise in his chest. "Dorothy, they're not vagrants. They're a family in crisis. Would you have me turn away a mother and her hungry children?" "I would have you follow proper procedures," she replied crisply. "There are organizations designed to handle these situations. The church is not a homeless shelter. We have insurance concerns, liability issues, not to mention what the congregation will think when they arrive for Wednesday evening service and find strangers living in our fellowship hall." The conversation that followed was heated but civil, ending with Dorothy's ultimatum disguised as concern. "Samuel, I've known you since you were a young minister fresh out of seminary. I've watched you build this church into something beautiful. Don't let misguided charity destroy what we've worked so hard to create. Give them some money and help them find appropriate services. That's the responsible thing to do. After she left, Samuel sat in his office staring at the cross on his wall, feeling for the first time in decades like a stranger in his own spiritual home. Through his window, he could see little Sophia helping her mother sweep the fellowship hall, their quiet dignity shining brighter than the morning sun streaming through the stained glass. That afternoon, Samuel called every social service agency in a 50-mile radius. The story was always the same: no available beds, waiting lists measured in weeks, emergency assistance funds depleted until next month. The system designed to catch falling families had gaping holes, and the Vasquez family was slipping through like water through broken fingers. As evening approached and the congregation began arriving for Wednesday night Bible study, Samuel made a decision that would change everything. He would address the situation directly, trusting in the love and compassion he had spent decades preaching about. Surely his flock would open their hearts as Christ had commanded. The fellowship hall buzzed with curious whispers and nervous energy as 63 members settled into their chairs, the usual comfortable atmosphere replaced by something charged with tension and uncertainty. Elena had taken the children to the church library, giving them picture books to read, while she waited nervously for whatever judgment was about to fall upon their heads, her hands trembling as she helped Miguel trace letters on a coloring page, while Sophia read quietly in a corner, both children sensing the adult anxiety that filled the air like electricity before a storm. Samuel stood before his congregation, these people he had baptized in moments of joy, married in ceremonies filled with hope, and buried in services heavy with grief. These souls he had shepherded through 27 years of joys and sorrows, celebrations and disappointments. He knew every face in that room, had held their hands through crises, had counseled their children, had shared their triumphs and failures as if they were family. Margaret Watson sat in the front row, her arthritic fingers worrying the clasp of her pocketbook, her loyalty to Samuel warring with her practical concerns about church finances. Behind her, the Brennan family filled an entire pew, Harold's weathered hands folded across his chest, while his wife Ruth kept glancing toward the library, where muffled children's voices occasionally drifted through the closed door. "Friends," Samuel began, his voice carrying the weight of conviction earned through decades of faithful service, "tonight we have an opportunity to live out our faith in the most direct way possible, to move beyond the comfortable abstractions of Sunday sermons into the messy reality of love in action. A family seeks shelter among us, not for comfort or convenience, but for survival in the most literal sense." He told Elena's story with the same passion he brought to his sermons, his voice rising and falling with practiced rhythm as he painted her struggles in words that made them real and immediate to people who had never faced eviction or hunger. He spoke of children sleeping in cars, of mothers choosing between medicine and meals, of systems designed to help but overwhelmed by need. When he finished, silence settled over the room like snow-muffling sound, heavy and expectant, broken only by the whisper of shifting bodies and the distant sound of turning pages from the library, where two children waited to learn their fate. Then, Harold Brennan, a retired factory worker whose hands bore the permanent stains of honest labor and whose loyalty to St. Matthew's spanned 4 decades, stood up slowly, his joints protesting the movement in audible pops and creaks. "Pastor Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the authority of age and experience, "my heart goes out to this family, it truly does. I've been hungry myself, back during the recession of '81 when the plant closed and I couldn't find work for 8 months. I know what it means to choose between heat and food, to lie awake worrying about your children's future." He paused, his gaze moving around the room, connecting with familiar faces that reflected his own struggle between compassion and caution. "But we're not equipped to house people, Pastor. We don't have the insurance for it, the facilities for it, the training for it. What happens when word gets out that St. Matthew's is taking in homeless families? How many more will show up expecting the same treatment? We'll be overwhelmed within a month, and then we won't be able to help anybody." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering like wind through wheat, heads nodding in reluctant acknowledgement of practical realities that seemed to mock their Sunday morning proclamations of love and service. Sarah Chen, a young mother of 3, added her voice to the growing chorus of concern. "I feel terrible for them, but I have to think about my own children's safety. We don't really know anything about these people. What if the woman has a criminal background? What if there's a reason they're homeless that we don't understand?" Samuel felt something cold and sharp pierce his heart as he watched his congregation, these people he loved, transform before his eyes into strangers, focused more on protection than compassion. "Are we seriously going to discuss the background checks of a hungry child?" he asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "That's not fair, Pastor," Dorothy interjected firmly. "We're being practical. We're being responsible. Nobody wants children to suffer, but there are proper channels for this kind of help. We pay taxes that fund social services for exactly this purpose." The debate that followed grew increasingly heated. Voices raised, Bibles quoted selectively, fears voiced with growing boldness. Samuel watched in growing horror as his congregation split into factions. The majority sided with caution and procedure. A smaller group advocated for temporary help with strict limitations. Only 3 members, including elderly Mrs. Patterson, who cleaned the church every week without payment, spoke unequivocally for opening their doors. "Jesus didn't conduct background checks on the people he helped," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He didn't worry about liability insurance when he fed the 5,000 or when he let children come to him. Sometimes faith means taking risks that don't make sense to the world." But her words were drowned in the tide of practical concerns and fearful what-ifs that filled the room like rising water. When the meeting ended, the decision was clear, though never formally voted upon. The Vasquez family would be given some money for a motel and connected with appropriate agencies. The church would resume its normal operations without disruption. Samuel stood alone in the empty fellowship hall afterward, feeling more isolated than he had ever felt in his life. Through the doorway, he could see Elena sitting with her children in the library, their faces pale with the understanding that comes to those who have heard their fate decided by others. They had heard the raised voices, the arguments, the final silence that spoke louder than words. That night, as Samuel helped Elena pack their few belongings, she looked at him with eyes that held no accusation, only a sadness that seemed to echo from somewhere deeper than personal disappointment. "Pastor Morrison," she said softly, "I want you to know that your kindness meant everything to us, even if it was only for one night. Sometimes that's all angels are supposed to give." Her words hit him like a physical blow. As the family disappeared into the darkness toward a motel that would take what little money the church had provided, Samuel stood in his empty sanctuary, feeling like he had just failed the most important test of his ministry. The following weeks passed in a haze of routine sermons and hollow fellowship, Sunday mornings that felt like performances, staged for an audience that no longer believed in the play. Samuel went through the motions of pastoral care, visiting the sick, counseling the troubled, performing the weekly rituals that had once felt sacred but now seemed mechanical and empty. But something fundamental had broken inside him the night he watched his congregation choose safety over service, something that all the theological training in the world couldn't repair. He found himself questioning not just his congregation, but his own understanding of what it meant to follow Christ's teachings in a world that seemed designed to punish such following. Had he fought hard enough for Elena and her children? Had he failed them when they needed him most? Had his own comfortable assumptions about human goodness blinded him to the harder truths about leading people toward love when love required sacrifice? The questions followed him through his daily routines, whispering accusations during his morning prayers, interrupting his sermon preparations with doubts that felt like physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. He had become a pastor, without a clear understanding of his purpose, a shepherd who had lost confidence in his ability to guide the flock toward anything resembling righteousness. Then on a grey Tuesday morning 6 weeks after that December night, when winter had settled over Millbrook like a shroud that might never lift, Samuel received a phone call that would shatter everything he thought he knew about divine providence, human nature, and his own role in the cosmic drama of redemption and judgment. The voice on the other end belonged to Detective Ray Martinez from the State Police, a man whose tone carried the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to delivering news that would change people's lives in ways they couldn't anticipate. "Pastor Morrison, I understand you recently helped a woman named Elena Vasquez and her children. I need to ask you some questions about that interaction, and I think it would be better if we spoke in person rather than over the phone." Samuel's blood turned to ice water, his grip tightening on the receiver until his knuckles went white with the pressure. "Is Elena all right? Are the children safe? Has something happened to them?" The detective's pause lasted only seconds, but felt like hours, filled with the terrible anticipation of learning that his worst fears about failing to protect the vulnerable had come true in ways he never could have imagined. "Sir, they're physically safe, but there are some things about Mrs. Vasquez that you need to know, things that might change how you view what happened at your church that night. Can you come down to the station this afternoon?" The drive to the police station felt like traveling through thick fog, his familiar town transformed into something alien and threatening. Every landmark a reminder of how little he truly understood about the world he had spent decades trying to serve. Samuel's mind raced through possibilities, each more terrible than the last. Scenarios involving child abuse, domestic violence, criminal activity that would make his congregation's caution look not like fear, but like wisdom he had been too naive to recognize. Had something happened to the family? Had his congregation's fears proven justified in ways he couldn't have imagined? Detective Martinez was a kind man with tired eyes who gestured for Samuel to sit in a small office that smelled of old coffee and fluorescent lights. "Pastor, what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to process. Elena Vasquez is not who she claimed to be." The detective opened a thick file and spread photographs across the desk. Samuel saw Elena's face looking back at him, but these were mugshots, booking photos that painted a very different picture of the woman who had stood outside his church with desperate eyes. Her real name is Elena Rodriguez. She's a known con artist who specializes in targeting religious communities. This isn't the first church where she's shown up with children claiming to be homeless. In fact, those children aren't even hers. Samuel felt the room spin around him. "What do you mean they're not hers?" "Sophia and Miguel are the children of Elena's sister, Maria, who lives in the next county. Maria works double shifts as a nurse and pays Elena to watch the kids. Elena has been using them as props in elaborate schemes to extract money and shelter from charitable organizations." The detective continued, his voice gentle but relentless. "Over the past 2 years, Elena has worked this same scheme at 17 different churches across 3 states. She researches the communities first, learns enough to make her story believable, then shows up during bad weather when people's sympathy is highest." Samuel stared at the photographs, feeling like he was looking at evidence of his own profound stupidity. But the children looked so hungry, so scared. She keeps them hungry before these performances, tells them they're playing a game, that they need to look sad to help mommy. Child Services has been trying to build a case against her, but the children's mother works so much she doesn't realize what's happening during their visits with Elena. The detective leaned forward, his expression compassionate. "Pastor, I want you to understand something important. You weren't the first person to be fooled by Elena Rodriguez, and you probably won't be the last. She's very good at what she does. She studies human nature, exploits our desire to help, uses our own goodness against us." Samuel drove back to his church in a daze, Detective Martinez's words echoing in his mind like accusations. The congregation had been right. Their caution, their fear, their practical concerns had all been justified. He had been the fool, the naive idealist, who nearly led his church into supporting a criminal enterprise. That Sunday he stood before his congregation with the weight of truth pressing down on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He told them everything Detective Martinez had revealed, watching their faces shift from surprise to satisfaction to something that looked uncomfortably like triumph. "I owe you all an apology," Samuel said, his voice heavy with defeat. "You showed wisdom, where I showed only foolish sentiment. You protected our church from being exploited while I nearly opened our doors to a criminal who was using children as tools in her deception." But instead of the vindication he expected to see, Samuel noticed something else in their faces, a sadness that mirrored his own. Dorothy Hendricks, who had argued most forcefully against helping Elena, looked troubled rather than victorious. After the service, she approached him with an expression he had never seen before. "Samuel, what happened with that woman doesn't change the fact that there are real families out there who genuinely need help. Just because one person deceived us doesn't mean we should stop being compassionate. Old Mrs. Patterson, who had advocated for helping Elena despite the risks, put her weathered hand on Samuel's arm. "Pastor, I've been thinking about this all week. Maybe the real test wasn't about Elena at all. Maybe it was about what kind of people we choose to be when faced with need, even if that need turns out to be fabricated." Her words planted a seed of thought that grew throughout the following week. Samuel found himself returning again and again to the memory of that December night, but now he saw it through different eyes. Yes, Eleanor had been a fraud. Yes, his congregation's concerns had proven valid. But what did that mean for the next desperate family that might appear at their door? 2 weeks later, Samuel received another call that would complete his understanding of that winter night's true meaning. This time, the voice belonged to Maria Rodriguez, Elena's sister and the real mother of Sophia and Miguel. "Pastor Morrison," she said, her voice thick with tears, "I need to tell you something about my children, about what they told me after that night at your church." Samuel listened as Maria explained how Sophia and Miguel had come home from their visit with Elena and told her about the kind pastor who had fed them and given them warm beds. They had described his gentleness, his obvious care, the way he had treated them like precious souls rather than burdens to be managed. "They said you made them feel safe for the first time in months," Maria continued. "You see, Pastor, Elena had been telling them that people didn't really care about children like them, that kindness was always fake, that adults only pretended to love kids when they wanted something. But you changed that for them." Maria's voice broke as she continued. "Sophia asked me why the nice pastor's friends didn't want them to stay. Miguel has been having nightmares about being unwanted ever since. They don't understand the adult complexities. They just know that someone was kind to them, and then other people made them leave." The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour. Maria explained how she had been working with social services to ensure her children were safe, how Elena was facing charges not just for fraud, but for child endangerment. But she also shared something that cut Samuel to his core. "Pastor Morrison, in all the churches Elena visited, you were the only one who actually saw my children as human beings, rather than problems to be solved. Even though you didn't know they weren't really homeless, you treated them with the kind of love Jesus talked about. That matters more than you know." After Maria hung up, Samuel sat in his office surrounded by the silence that had become his constant companion. Outside his window, snow was beginning to fall again, and he found himself thinking about divine tests and human responses, about the difference between being wise and being faithful. That evening, he called an emergency meeting of the church board. The 7 members gathered in the fellowship hall where Elena and her borrowed children had spent one night being treated like family before being evaluated like risks. "I've learned something important about that December night," Samuel began, looking at each familiar face around the table. "We've been focused on the fact that Elena Rodriguez was a fraud, that we were right to be cautious, that our practical concerns proved valid. But I think we're missing the real question." He stood up, pacing as he tried to put his thoughts into words. "The real question isn't whether Elena deserved our help. It's whether we're going to let fear of being deceived prevent us from helping people who genuinely need it. Because as surely as Elena was a fraud, there are real families out there facing real desperation." Dorothy Hendricks shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Samuel, what are you suggesting? That we ignore the lesson we learned?" "I'm suggesting that the lesson we learned might not be the one we think." Samuel looked around the room at these people he had served with for years, these flawed, fearful, faithful souls, struggling just like him to understand what God required of them. Eleanor's children told their mother that we were the only church that made them feel truly welcome, even though we ultimately asked them to leave. What if the test that night wasn't about discernment or wisdom? What if it was about whether we would choose love over fear when faced with need? The conversation that followed was different from the heated debate 6 weeks earlier. This time, voices stayed low, hearts stayed open, and minds grappled with questions that had no easy answers. How do you help without enabling? How do you show compassion without being naive? How do you protect your community while remaining open to strangers? Mrs. Patterson, who had been quiet through most of the discussion, finally spoke up. "Maybe the answer isn't about having perfect knowledge before we act. Maybe it's about acting with love and dealing with consequences as they come. Perfect discernment is God's job. Imperfect love is ours." Her words hung in the air like incense, sweetening the atmosphere with their simple wisdom. Samuel felt something stirring in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced since that December night when he first saw Elena's desperate face. "What if we created a proper system?" he suggested. "A way to help families in crisis while also protecting ourselves and them. We could partner with social services, set up temporary assistance programs, create a network with other churches to share resources and verify needs." Harold Brennan, who had been one of the strongest voices for caution, nodded slowly. "We could have protocols that show love while also showing wisdom, guidelines that let us help without being foolish about it." Over the next month, St. Matthew's transformed its approach to community outreach. They established partnerships with local agencies, created a crisis assistance fund, and developed procedures for helping families in emergency situations. They trained volunteers in both compassion and discernment, learning to ask loving questions without interrogation, to offer help with boundaries. But the most significant change was in Samuel himself. The experience with Elena had stripped away his naive assumptions about human nature, while deepening his understanding of divine grace. He preached now with a different kind of authority, the authority of someone who had faced the complexity of love in action and chosen to continue loving anyway. 6 months after that snowy December night, Samuel received a letter that would provide the final piece of understanding he needed. It came from Sofia Rodriguez, Elena's borrowed daughter, written in the careful handwriting of a child who had learned to express profound thoughts. "Dear Pastor Morrison," the letter began, "I wanted to tell you thank you for the night you let us stay in your church. My tia Eleanor said you were just another person who would pretend to care and then make us leave. But you weren't pretending. I could tell because you looked at me like my mama does, like I matter." The letter continued with the innocent wisdom that only children possess. "I know the grown-ups were scared of us, and that's why we had to go. Mama explained that some people do bad things, and that makes other people worried. But you weren't worried. You just saw hungry kids and fed us. That's what Jesus would do." Samuel had to stop reading several times, his vision blurred by tears that carried years of doubt and confusion. Sophia's letter concluded with words that would echo in his heart for the rest of his ministry. "I hope other kids who are really hungry get to meet you someday. I think God put you in that church so lost people would have somewhere safe to go. Even if they can't stay forever, at least they'll know for one night that somebody cares." That Sunday, Samuel preached about divine tests and human responses, about the difference between being shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. He spoke about Elena Rodriguez and her deception, but also about Sofia and Miguel and their need for human kindness regardless of the adults who were using them. "We will never have perfect knowledge about who deserves our help," he told his congregation. "We will sometimes be deceived, sometimes taken advantage of, sometimes hurt by our own generosity. But the alternative to risking deception is the certainty of missing opportunities to serve Christ in the least of these." He looked out at the faces before him, these people who had wrestled alongside him through questions that had no easy answers. "Our new assistance programs will help us be both wise and loving. But even more important than any system we create is the heart we bring to each encounter with human need. Will we lead with fear or with faith? Will we protect ourselves first or love others first?" The congregation that voted unanimously to expand their outreach ministry that day was not the same group that had debated Elena's fate 6 months earlier. They had been refined by the fire of difficult choices, humbled by their own fallibility, and ultimately strengthened by choosing love despite uncertainty. St. Matthew's Church became known throughout the region for its innovative approach to crisis assistance. They helped dozens of families over the following years, some genuinely desperate, others less than truthful about their circumstances. They learned to navigate the complex waters between compassion and wisdom, building a ministry that honored both the needs of those seeking help and the concerns of those providing it. But Samuel knew that the real transformation had happened not in their programs or procedures, but in their hearts. They had learned to hold loosely to their expectations of who deserved help while holding tightly to their commitment to help anyway. They had discovered that perfect discernment was less important than persistent love. Years later, when young pastors would ask Samuel about the most important lesson of his ministry, he would tell them about a snowy December night when strangers appeared at his door. He would explain about tests that came disguised as opportunities, about wisdom that looked like foolishness, and foolishness that looked like wisdom. The real test wasn't about Elena Rodriguez, he would say. It was about what kind of people we would choose to be when faced with need we couldn't fully understand. Would we let the possibility of deception prevent us from showing love? Would we choose protection over compassion? He would pause then, remembering the faces of two children who had needed to feel valued, regardless of the adult who was exploiting them. In the end, I think God was less concerned about whether we got it right than about whether we got it loving. Because love always takes risks. Love always chooses hope over fear, and sometimes when we're willing to be fooled for love's sake, we discover that we've been wise in ways we never expected. The snow still falls every December in Millbrook, and Samuel Morrison still serves as pastor of St. Matthew's Church. But now when strangers appear at his door seeking help, he greets them with eyes that have seen both the worst and best of human nature. He offers assistance through systems designed for both generosity and wisdom. And he remembers always that divine tests rarely come labeled as such, that opportunities for grace often wear the disguise of inconvenience, and that the most important questions in life are not about who deserves our love, but about whether we will choose to love anyway. In the end, Elena Rodriguez had given him the greatest gift a teacher can offer, even if she never intended to teach anything at all. She had shown him that faith without risk is not faith at all, that love without vulnerability is not love at all, and that sometimes being willing to be a fool for Christ's sake is the wisest thing a person can do. The test had been passed, though not in any way Samuel could have imagined when he first opened his church door to strangers in the snow. He had learned that divine providence works through human foolishness as often as human wisdom, and that the heart willing to be broken by love's demands is often the heart most ready to receive grace.